I actually got introduced more into space relations. My main important part of my job is to deal with our military sites throughout the state of Arkansas. Fell on this one by accident. This is actually an 85-foot diameter parabolic antenna, better known as an Earth station, part of the Hughes Corporation. This was actually developed by Ling Temco Law out of Dallas, Texas, specifically for Hughes aircraft in 1965. They had partnered up with Nippon Electric to develop multi-access communication system, which is actually what runs our cell phones at this point. This was the first development of it. And if you look, here's the actual plate from LTV. And you can't really see it here, but it's serial number 1. This is the only one that was ever made. They wanted to make smaller ones for smaller countries. But this is the only one to develop. This actually sits out in the Ouachita Mountains, completely abandoned up through about 2015. And this was my first introduction to more space-related objects in Arkansas. There was originally a paper asking, are there space-related objects out there in your states, and see what we can find. We had this one, and while doing research on it, fell onto the space fence. There's an article that says this is the second space-related object that the state of Arkansas has. And I was like, well, let's go find it. So that brings us to this. It's the high-tech clothesline. Not exactly what I thought I was going to find after starting to do research on what is our second space-related object in the state of Arkansas. But we got a king-size clothesline, was its colloquial name across the southern part of the United States, because this is what it looked like. We're going to go through a little bit of this. The catalyst for the space race was widely known by the launching of the Soviet Union's Sputnik in 1957, but it was President John F. Kennedy that instigated the space race for itself. The United States government all but voided the possibilities of creating satellites and/or intercontinental ballistic missiles by 1945. However, the United States completely mothballed the idea up until 1954. Talk a lot about the beach and rocket. The idea of space being a race or a competition was only first mentioned in the 1960 Democratic presidential platform claiming that the Republican Party allowed the Russians to, quote, forge ahead in space. This would be the first of many times describing it as a competition between the two governments, which were used to agitate the public into escalating patriotism and space exploration and military might. The space race was not really a race at all, but a period of time in which the Cold War allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to flex both its military muscle, its political might, and all of its intellectual muscle at that point in time, using the space program in order to gain superiority over the other. It is at this time that a large contingent of the world's population began to call for space to be a place of peace, which we sort of talked about in the treaty from 1967. The treaty adopted from the original declaration passed in 1962, but added a language claiming that the celestial bodies of the moon gaining the placement of nuclear weapons, which we talked about already. Trying to have space in place, no nuclear weapons. NAVSPAR, as it was known, which stands for the Naval Space Surveillance System, later known as the Air Force Space Surveillance System, is known as the Space Fence. The system was designed to detect and track objects as small as 30 centimeters, about the size of a basketball orbit. So here are just some objects that are roughly 30 centimeters that you can think of. We got a 2-liter bottle, 2 hot dogs, a toaster oven, and a basketball. Even though basketball is really more like 24 centimeters. They went with it. The entire space surveillance system is comprised of 9 field stations, 3 transmitters, and 6 receiving stations, roughly located between a 32 degrees north and 34 degrees north longitude. The locations were originally chosen because they lie in the path of the Navy's Vanguard satellite, which we just sort of talked about, Vanguard 1. The typical makeup of each installation varied, but would generally consist of a perimeter fence, operations building, large water tank, and depending on the function, multiple receiving or transmitting antenna arrays. The transmitting arrays would emit a continuous beam or fence of radar energy, while the receivers listen for the radar returns from the objects in orbit passing through the fence. Orbiting satellites and other objects across the fence reflected the radio waves back to Earth, where the waves were collected by the 6 receiving stations. According to the Navy in 1959, the transmitter sent out a fan-shaped beam as thin as a piece of paper, where the 2 receiving stations located on either side of the transmitter would pick it up. Upon receiving the reflected radio waves, the purported object, the data was collected, triangulated, and then reflected that data to a receiving station where it created an XYZ coordinate system. which was then later transmitted to NAVSPAR Processing Operations Center at Dalton Air Force Base, at Dalton, via a dedicated phone line. I don't know if you want to run a dedicated phone line from South Arkansas all the way to Dalton, but that's what they did. The 3 transmitting stations were located at the Gila River Station in Maricopa, Arizona, Lake Kickapoo Station in Archer City, Texas, and the Jordan Lake Station in Titus, Alabama. The 6 receiving stations were located in San Diego. Elephant Butte Station was located at Truth Consequences, New Mexico. The Red River Station in Louisville, Arkansas. The Silver Lake Station in Hollandale, Mississippi. Hawkinsville Station in Hawkinsville, Georgia. And Tatnall Station in Glenville, Georgia. If you know anything about any of those places, they're about as remote as you can get. Like, you're not in a population-dense area. You're in, at least in Hollandale, you're in a cotton field. At the time, NAVSPAR was designed to track inactive or passive satellites. Once the data was collected and entered into the system, it was located and geoplotted on an illustrated world map, which was located in all man-made debris found circulating throughout the globe. This map was the third part of a 3-part system that included detection, and then tracking and prediction, and then later what they called SPAD score, which is where they did present, past, and future tracking areas on a map to see where they were going to go. With a flick of switch, you'd be able to see the locations of past hours, even days, or even weeks in advance of where they were going to go. Now, the NAVSPAR system was added as a central element to the Defense Department's satellite tracking and warning facilities. SPAD-score, they named it that because what it actually looked like was a baseball score sheet as it went through. So they went through and just sort of made it the score part being log mode. The first satellite system to track created was not actually the Space Fence, but it was the first of its kind. NAVSPAR was created, was preceded by the Project Vanguard satellite program. Yet part of the original mini-track system, which Vanguard used, was the foundation for the future of the NAVSPAR system. The NRL, or the Naval Research Laboratory, would be able to maintain their space presence with the Department of Defense. And with the ARPA authorized the NRL to provide a tracking complex in both the east and western United States, and made up of transmitter stations and receiving stations. So you can sort of see it here. The first station to go online was Ratermann, Georgia, which is largely associated with Fort Stewart, and later Jordan Lake, Alabama. They were able to get these 2 stations up and online quickly because they were able to modify the Fort Stewart mini-track antenna to be capable with the new system in 1957. And so this is sort of what it looks like now. Here's the original one and what it looks like now in 22. A lot has disappeared in a short period of time. The Silver Lake Station was able to become operational in 1958 and is noted by the end of 58 that several steps needed to be taken for the fulfillment of the requirements of the program, including adding a second receiving station in the eastern complex to sort of fill that out, so one on each side. The news finally broke on February 14th of 1959 in the article released with the United States International Press discussing the open house at Silver Lake Station in February of 1959, stating that $500,000 of special equipment is located on a cotton plantation near here, which was in Hollandale, Mississippi. It's serving as an eye into space to make sure no satellite is lost without the nation knowing it. The Navy Friday took the wraps off the Silver Lake Space Station. We announced it to the public, showing it with 5 stations along the nation. $500,000 sitting in a cotton field. Great economics, great for political, propaganda at this point in time. People in Mississippi and Hollandale didn't really care it was there. They sort of got used to it. The one-day open house at the site was clear that it was an undertaking surrounding the site. Upon receiving questions and interest from civilians and news media during this open house, it became very obvious that the questions were all focused on the Soviet Union and the role in space exploration. One of the questions asked pertained to unknown Soviet satellites that may have tracked across the beam, or the fence, as they call it. At that point in time, Captain Byrd decided as saying that they were able to successfully locate 5 unknown space objects and several meteorites. And we'll just sort of track this number as we go through here. So we got 5 right now that we're tracking, roughly a year and a half in. The NRL's first public forum was waited for Silver Lake and the Eastern Complex to sort of be promoted by the NRL and Bendix, which was the corporation that was running these sites. They sought to do the same thing with the Western Complex. The last station to become operational in the NRL Medics was able to have another open house in the Gila River region out in the west in March of 1959. Yet the first real test in this case of a foreign unknown object was detected by the Space Fence and discovered in January of 1960. Yet it wasn't made public until late February of 1960. Many of the newspapers were published articles of the mysterious object floating above Earth because of the hysteria that was actually going on in the Pentagon. Mass hysteria inside the Pentagon over what this was. Newspapers finally caught word of it and finally put it out there, yet no one really knew what it was. Causing more hysteria over the unidentified object, the Department of Defense didn't help anything. They were also throwing out bad information, causing more hysteria within the American public and frightening people. It was stated that the object had been under surveillance and reported by NAVSPAR. They again published out speculative news and quipped about the object was orbiting the poles, and that this orbit would be able to be a very desirable orbit for this type of, quote, seeing eye satellite, with few island objects that would be silent, orbiting over the poles, and that the Soviet Union was probably deactivating the object over the United States, so it couldn't be found. However, it was finally during the later part of early 1960 that the Department of Defense finally relaxed its speculation about the mystery satellite when it stated it was just part of a launch vehicle. Now you can be taken one of two ways. They still didn't know what it was, and that was a good way to cover it back up, or they just wanted the media to sort of let off. The two problems were finally found due to this unexpected object. We had a west gate, and we had an east gate, and we got nothing in the middle. We figured out we had this really big, huge gap. So it finally took a problem to realize that we got a 700-mile gap between Elephant Butte and the edge of Mississippi and Arkansas. So once they did this, the range of the fan-like beam, while also recognizing there was a large gap in the fence. This gap was 700 miles wide, and the two fan-like beams would allow for a, quote, secret satellite to evade detection if someone knew the gap was there. Yet the first couple of years of existence, the NAVSPAR system caught a fair amount of publicity while tracking previously unidentified objects. The newfound fame shined the spotlight on the project and thus helped garner a new nickname for the general public, being the king-size clothesline. Because of its large T-shaped antenna arrays, which look like these old-style clothesline poles that we all sort of had in our backyards growing up. Given the amount of space debris in the orbit at that point in time in early 1962 and what we have today up there, they were reporting in early 1960 that we now had 12 objects that they were actively tracking. Though it seems like a relatively small number to rockets in space, it seems a substantial number given that station direction was only 2 years old when it was published. The fear of the gap was helped found the Navy and Naval Research Laboratory to jumpstart and try to fill that gap and start that closure between Elephant Butte and Silver Lake in Mississippi. Now I'll just tell you what was going on. We talk about the newspapers sort of catching wind of these projects, but they weren't doing a really good job of actively telling what it is because the newspapers were publishing the photos upside down. I mean, when the newspaper got it and they couldn't tell you to flip the antenna array upside down, you know, this is what we got. So this is out of Troy, New York newspaper with everything upside down. So that sort of gives you how well they were doing their public programming. A new transmitter station was going to need to be located in order to help close that 700-mile gap. Unlike other stations, the Kickapoo Lake antenna actually goes across the road. All the rest of them are 130-acre, 60-acre sites, fairly enclosed. This one actually had a farm road that runs right through the middle of it. So it's two fenced-off areas with the antenna array separated. This station at Kickapoo would end up being completed in June of 1961. But we have all this fun stuff going on. Like we're looking at objects. In 1960, we still need a good PR campaign. Typical military fashion, NORAD, the beginning of NORAD tracking Santa. The Space Fence was originally the first person to do that. So they sent it out, talking about tracking Santa, all SPAR personnel on alert over the poles, using the Space Fence in order to track Santa. So it's sort of that fun precursor to what NORAD was doing at the time. Object may be identified by a red glowing emitted nose and leading objects from its nose cone. Satellite capsule may be manned, occupant friendly, is believed to voice transmission, may resemble sounds, Merry Christmas to all. So just a fun little side out of that one. Following the Christmas holiday in 1960, the NRL got back to work trying to continuously track objects in orbit. Yet it was in April of 1961 that the NAVSPAR system demonstrated its capabilities to the American public by locating and identifying materials that were not boosters and not rockets. The Space Fence was able to locate and identify a piece of wire 8 feet long, roughly the thickness of a pencil. It was noted in the NRL that this piece of wire was identified as part of a cable-type design device that was able to show the American public capabilities of the system. It was later joked that if you lost a hairpin and you really wanted help finding it in space, you would call one of the transmitting stations where they would then help you find your hairpin that you lost and then find that back. Or at least tell you where it was going to be orbiting through. Sort of the running joke along the stations there. Just before positive identification of these small objects previously noted, Roger Easton, who was influential not only in the Vanguard system, the mini-track system, but also in the Space Fence, went ahead and then applied for a patent for this entire system under the for the Navy in 1961. The patent by Mr. Easton, this is 3 years after the first one was, or 4 years after the first one was created, finally running through the patent. Noted that the inherent problems with the tracking system is the speed of the travel and altitude at which most of these were orbiting, thus creating a very short window or window of time in which you could observe the object and need for the system have great capabilities. In the patent application, in order to try to create the pattern of the object that there is currently in, you must first know it existed, which is part of the problem. We needed something to know it existed in order to then track it to see where it was at. So he at least admitted his problem in that. It was finally approved, the patent was finally approved in February of 1964. This is actually part of the patent up here. By 1962, NAVSPAR stations located across the United States were operationally part of NORAD. So we have a Navy system now stuck in with the Air Force. I don't know about you all, growing up in military facilities, Air Force, Navy, Army, nobody gets along. There's a general camaraderie that if they can pick on each other, but don't anybody on the outside pick on them. So it wasn't working as well as it probably should or as much as everybody wanted to. But they still directly reported to NRL at Dahlgren, even though they were part of NORAD. The actual chain of command looks something like this. NAVSPAR stations reported to NRL at Dahlgren, the NRL at Dahlgren then reported to the Navy, and to an organization known as SPADX, which is Space Detection and Tracking System. SPADX then reported to NORAD. Government red tape at its best. Go through 4 different chains. You gotta understand, it's probably like the telephone game, where somewhere along there we're gonna get lost in translation. And that's generally what happened. SPADX then reported where the object took place and analyzed the data from each subordinate and analyzed it again and whether it could be used for, at that time, a potential attack. With the changes that took place in 62 and 63, NAVSPAR was about to add to the system. In October of 1963, it finally came around that the station would be located in Arkansas. The station would be located 2 miles south of Louisville, Arkansas, and with the announcement that the Navy would lease 60 acres, and it would be known as the Red River Surveillance Station. Though the previous stations were able to track, quote, dark satellites, it was again stated that the significant military implications of this. The system would be able to detect all satellites, even unannounced ones. In a drastic turn of events, the construction at the Red River Valley site and the discussion of planning a second receiving and transmitting station was in the go. So at this point in time, all of a sudden, you get a second receiver line that shows up in Funton, Texas, over here on your left side, and then Raymondville. I've been able to track the Funston site. Raymondville doesn't seem to ever have existed at all. At least one site was built. Second one was never built in order to transmit this. I can find no evidence of this second station at all. So if anybody knows where it is or knows anything about it, that'd be great. In 1966, the program celebrated by watching the sky for uncatalogued objects. When it ended identifying 2 objects, and went from identifying 2 objects to over 200 objects a month, and stressing that opportunity. It took until 1973 before anyone really discovered that the data collected by NASWAR could be used by NASA. It was finally stated that one idea was to tell NASA that this stuff existed out there, to know where that quote hole was, and that hole being referred to as the area where a shuttle could pass through without colliding with unidentified objects. The idea is that this collision is unlikely, really continued to help narrow that idea of where stuff is, has continued to narrow throughout the system. The trajectory of space satellites and travel sort of made everybody nervous. They sort of find that gap and shoot it whenever you go. You go up through there. By the early 1980s, the Navy space program and the Air Force space programs were no longer working cordially together. They were just sort of doing the dance. Sort of like we talked about with the contractors today, nobody wants to give away proprietary secrets. Well, the Navy and the Air Force didn't want to know either. So at that point, they would work together in data collection under the umbrella of NORAD. The two always tried to outmaneuver each other for more dominance. NORAD was never a unified space command as they wanted, but a repository for data in various organizations. Therefore, in early 1980, the Air Force began pushing the unified space command idea. The Navy fought it, but eventually lost out in 1985, when the U.S. Space Command was officially announced. By the mid-1980s, coming through the Naval Space Command newsletters, it finally became more evident that what the Navy was also trying to do was use this militarily. It was all sort of space detection, what's out there, but going through some of the military publications, we finally figured out what they were trying to do, and that was use real-time data to influence leaders in the field, battlefields, on who could be tracking them at any given point in time. This was at least the first admittance of it in the 1980s. Since 2013, the original NAVSPAR sites have largely been abandoned. The Red River site in Arkansas still remains with the Air Force, which left it in 2013. The antenna arrays, maintenance buildings, operation, flagpole, preamp houses, storm shelters, water treatment facility have all been intact on the site. When I originally called the 21st Space Wing in 2017, they didn't even know they still owned it. I called them and was like, hey, you guys sent our office this report in 2013, talking about, taking the site down. You guys own it? And they're like, we have no record, we own it. We don't do anything out there. I said, I can tell. The grass is 6 foot tall. And so they sent me a little bit more information, but largely they didn't even know they had it. The sites have changed over the years. Many of the objects, at least in the initial report, stated that the objects out there are eligible for the National Register. Though it has been passed through military branches, significant sites, space surveillance have gone unrecognized here. Many of these places were hidden in rural landscapes with little fanfare, except for the occasional newspaper article. Though the initial fanfare waned, the large clothesline became a second nature to those that live there. The citizens surrounding it have come and gone, and the ideas of what has been done there has largely disappeared. Now the sites have been discontinued or used for other purposes. The history of these sites began to dissipate even further and have fallen from the memory of most that have been around. Significance and importance does not need to come from the glitz and glam, but the technical advantages that came from the projects that amazed the masses at the time. The question is, what do we do with it now? The Air Force didn't even know they had it, didn't remember that they had it, and it's largely just sitting there derelict, intact. Antenna arrays are still up, everything's still there, ready to go, but nobody occupies it. Forgotten for time. Thank you.